right, so I had a request for numbers 4, 5, 6, and 7 on the quarter 4 study guide. 4 and 5 were both looking at the composition of functions. So this was something that we learned in section 7.6 if you'd like to go back and watch the whole video. This is where we actually take a function and plug it into another function. So they are asking us to find f of g of 4. So they used the open circle. I just rewrote it with the parentheses, f of g of 4. So remember, for these problems, you'll work from the inside out. So you're actually going to find what g of 4 is first. So the very first thing we want to do is plug 4 in for g of x, which will get me negative 3 times 4 minus 7, which is negative 12 minus 7, which is then negative 19. All right, so that negative 19 gets replaced here. We'll get rid of that g of 4, and we'll have f of negative 19. So f of negative 19, then, we plug negative 19 in for x in the f of x function, getting me negative 2 times negative 19 minus 6. When we multiply two negatives together, we should get a positive 38. And then 38 minus 6 gets me 32 as a final answer. Number 5 is basically the same question, but it doesn't have numbers. So instead of f of g of 4, it's just f of g of x. So again, start on the inside. That means that this g of x function needs to get plugged in for x in the f of x function. So we should have 2 plus 3, and then instead of x, we're going to plug this whole thing in for x using parentheses. We need to distribute. 3 times 4 is 12x minus 3. And then last but not least, of course, combine our like terms and put in standard form. So we should have 12x minus 1. For the second part of the question, they ask us to go the other direction. So they want us to do g of f of x. So in this case, we're going to start on the inside, which is our f of x function. And we're going to plug that into x in the g of x function. So we should have 4 parentheses, 2 plus 3x, close our parentheses, and then our minus 1. Kind of think of it as like copying this and pasting it right here. Distribute. Should get 8 plus 12x, and then again combine our like terms, putting in standard form. We'll get 12x plus 7. So both of those were similar concepts, and those were from section 7.6. All right, the next two questions were 6 and 7. These were in section 7.7. Notice that they're kind of going in order. These ask us to find the inverse. When you're finding the inverse, remember the first thing that you do is you want to switch the x and the y. Variables around. So we're going to invert these. It will become x equals 6y squared plus 3. And then our second step, we're going to solve for y using inverse operations. So the first thing we would need to do is undo addition of 3 with subtraction of 3. We then need to undo multiplication of 6 with division of 6, which will get me y squared equals x minus 3 over 6. And then our last step is to square root. Now, when we add in that square root symbol, remember we should put in a positive and a negative symbol. So we should have plus or minus a big square root of x minus 3 over 6. That is a perfectly acceptable answer. If you wanted to, you could split these into two separate fractions, which would be x over 6 and then minus 3 over 6, which is 1/2. I don't care which answer you would come up with. I believe the multiple choice answers on the quarterly will look more like this. And the last question I got was number 7. Number 7 is very similar to 6. it asks us to determine f of -1. Remember, that stands for the inverse. So same thing, I first of all change this f of x to a y variable, and then we are going to switch these variables. So I'm going to make this the x variable and this the y variable. Swap those around. X will go here, y will go here. And then I actually started already solving. Right now I see a squared outside. So we are going to solve for y, taking the inverse of squaring something, which is square rooting. So I drew in those square root symbols on both sides. Go ahead and put a positive and negative symbol as well. And to solve for y, we need to undo addition of 7 with subtraction of 7. And lastly, undo multiplication of -5 with division of -5 on both sides. Now, these two negatives will divide out to get us a positive 7/5. And technically, this positive divided by a negative is negative, and then negative divided by negative is a positive. So you can just leave that plus minus symbol right there. And then it does ask you, is the inverse a function? So there are two ways we learn to do this. The first one is just to think about what this graph would look like. Remember, square root graphs make a half of a parabola, so that positive square root would look like this. The negative square root would look like this, and so this is not a function because it would fail the vertical line test. You also can use the horizontal line test on the original function if you'd like. The original function was a quadratic, which would just make a regular parabola. If you use the horizontal line test, it would fail that, meaning that the inverse is not a function. Hopefully this helps. If you guys have any more questions, just shoot me an email with the question number and I will make a short video.